transition is truly sustainable, we not only need to deploy use capacity of renewable energy such as offshore wind power, we also need to ensure that the deployment doesn't put pressure on our ecosystem, that we can maintain a healthy biodiversity. This is what we're going to hear about now. So welcome to this event on wind, communities and conservation. My name is Klaus Skytte. I'm the CEO of Nordic Energy Research. Nordic Energy Research is an institution under the auspice of the Nordic Council of Ministers. We finance energy research and facilitate the energy cooperation between the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands and Åland, as well as between the Nordic countries and our neighboring countries in the Arctic and the Baltics. With large wind resources in the Nordics, a massive offshore wind power deployment is expected to reach a 20-fold of the existing European capacity. Such an expansion will put pressure on the natural resources and create new challenges for spatial planning, building, operating, and finally decommissioning. Offshore wind-powered installation must accommodate the environment and be compatible with other uses of the sea. With the Nordic Prime Minister's joint declaration of carbon neutrality in 2019, and with the common vision of the Nordic region to become the most integrated and sustainable region in the world, it's obvious to look for Nordic solution. I believe that the Nordics can add value, since large offshore wind farms are already operating in our waters. And I'm convinced that wind developers will gather knowledge needed for sound strategic planning to mitigate environmental impact. Today, we will present findings from a forthcoming report that showcase experience from the Nordic region and our neighboring countries to explore how offshore wind power projects can accommodate biodiversity. It is my hope that this report will be a good companion to the important work undertaken by the International Union of Conservation of Nature and the Biodiversity Consultancy in preparing their guidelines for the offshore wind developers. Finally, I would like to express my strong gratitude to DNV and Malte Rosen in particular for preparing this comprehensive and timely report. I'm also grateful to SSE, the Scottish Energy Utility, the International Union of Conservation of Nature, the Biodiversity Consultancy, and the World Wide Fund for Nature for joining us in this orientation of the upcoming report. So, with this, I put the word to our moderator of today, Sven Sjølund, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Klaus. And let's start with the... So we have a very good panel here that's going to look into how we can build large offshore structures without jeopardizing biodiversity. And we have to look at both when we plan them, when we build them, when we operate them, and when we take them down. And for this, I'd like to first welcome Rachel Asante to the floor. And you're going to be accompanied by Biodiversity Consultancy in South Africa on the screen. But first, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak here today. It's very much appreciated. One of the key messages that has come through very clearly from COP26 in Glasgow has been the need to move quickly from fossil fuel energy towards renewable energy, and that we need to do this fast and we need to do this equitably if we're going to meet the 1.5 degree target that we all hope to limit ourselves to. It is clear that in order to move towards renewable energy, we're going to be looking at those energies that are the most cost-effective and the most clean and the most efficient. And one of those is clearly wind energy. And it comes as no surprise that in 2020, we saw the second biggest increase in wind energy installments ever. With a lifespan of between 20 to 30 years, wind farms have a great capacity to meet the renewable energy challenge that we have set ourselves globally, but they also have many consequences to the environment in the decisions that are made in developing and using wind energy. It is clear from IUCN's point of view that although we need to move towards the renewable energy and move towards a more wind energy development, that this movement needs to be done not at the expense of biodiversity, and we want to see a world where we have an equitable transition, but that renewable energy does not become a driver for biodiversity loss, and that we learn the lessons from the past and from our fossil fuel energy use. In that light, in 2019, IUCN started a new initiative around renewable energies. This was done in partnership with Electricité de France, EDF, and Energias de Portugal, EDP, and the Shell Group. We worked together in partnership with the Biodiversity Consultancy, and my colleague will give a more detailed look at the work that we did. I will give an overview of the work that we did over the 2 years. This work was carried out in a very inclusive manner, and it looked at how we could provide guidance to mitigate the effects on biodiversity of renewable energy generation. We brought into the discussion IUCN members, including Flora and Fauna International, BirdLife International, and the Biodiversity Conservancy. The output from this work were guidelines which were directed at the whole sector, but with particular focus on project developers, and the aim was to look and support actors to manage biodiversity risks associated with both solar and wind energy projects. As has already been stated, we recognize the risks to biodiversity come at all stages of the project's life cycle, from project planning through development through to decommissioning. One of the key approaches that was highlighted in the report was the use of the mitigation hierarchy, which incorporates an approach whereby developers are encouraged to measure their impacts on biodiversity, look for ways that they can avoid impacts on biodiversity. Those impacts that can't be avoided should be mitigated. Where possible, biodiversity should be restored. And this will leave developers with a residual impact on biodiversity, which can then be compensated through biodiversity offsets. Along with the mitigation hierarchy approach, we came up with some key elements for best practice when implementing renewable energy projects in order to mitigate impacts to biodiversity. Some of those key elements were around sensitivity mapping and early risk screening. This we saw as absolutely key to the process, because in order to mitigate biodiversity impacts, you first need to be able to analyze and recognize those impacts, and also recognize the area that you're working in, the key biodiversity that's in that area, and how you can avoid and mitigate those biodiversity actions. We also encouraged the use of an iterative approach towards the mitigation hierarchy. This is really around having a target, but constantly asking yourself, how are we progressing towards that target? Do we need to change the target? Do we need to focus more on a particular aspect of that target? So really having an adaptive management approach towards implementing the mitigation hierarchy. There's also a need to consider indirect and cumulative impacts. Indirect impacts are impacts that, although may not be done firsthand by the project, are a consequence of the project being in that environment. So we asked project operators to look at the consequences of their projects, and also to look at how their impacts may add on to impacts that are happening from other projects within the landscape and seascape, and make sure they took those into account in their mitigation measures. Finally, we also called for a robust monitoring system, and as I said previously, an adaptive approach towards biodiversity management, looking at what's happening on the ground and adapting the mechanisms used to give the best possible outcomes on the ground. I'm just going to focus for a minute on the cumulative impact assessment, because this is something that we felt really needed to be a focus of the report. It really was trying to convince project developers to look not just at their own particular impacts, but really how their impacts are added to by other impacts of projects that are happening in the landscape as well. We also said that cumulative impacts and looking at cumulative impacts can be an advantage, because you can work with others in your mitigation actions to have a much bigger effect in your seascape and landscape as well. Finally, I'll just say that there will be a phase 2 of IUCN's renewable energy work, and this phase will have much more of a focus on regulators, will focus on spatial planning, how to develop multifunctional landscapes that include renewable energy generation, and also how to identify areas that are ideal for renewable energy. And we'll also look at responsible sourcing of raw materials for renewable energy to make sure that the biodiversity impacts of renewable energy are not being seen elsewhere around the globe, and that we don't have these indirect impacts accumulating in different parts of the globe. This will be done with all our IUCN members, and I encourage anybody who's interested to work with IUCN on this project to get in touch. It's a very open process, and we are keen to hear all different points of views and all different experiences to add to the work that we plan to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. And I understand, yeah. So without much further ado, I think we just move on to South Africa. We can't hear. No sound. Just 1 second. It's coming. Hang on, Jan Willem.
I hope you can hear me.
You are getting, we can hear you now. That's sound. Okay, go ahead.
Hello, greetings from Cape Town, South Africa. I guess you can hear me now. Yes, thanks very much for the opportunity to briefly highlight some of the report findings. Rachel already covered some of the key points, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about the guidelines themselves and some of the key messages that are coming out of that. So if we can just move to the next slide, please.
Yeah, sorry.
Next slide.
You want to see the various birds?
Yeah, this is great.
Good.
So it's important to recognize that both solar and wind energy, onshore and offshore, do carry biodiversity risks, and there's a number of species groups that are particularly vulnerable to these kind of developments. There's been numerous studies that show, and indeed, evidence on the ground that indicates that many groups of birds are particularly vulnerable. You can imagine vultures and many migratory birds, bustards, raptors, but also some mammals, including flying mammals like bats, but in the case of offshore developments, marine mammals during the construction period are often vulnerable to such developments as well. So, as Rachel pointed out, it's really important that you not only manage the direct impacts from the project, but also assess and find ways to manage the indirect and cumulative impacts that arise when you have multiple projects all operating in the same area. And also it's important to account for the full development cycle. So not just looking at the project, but also understanding where the metals and minerals are coming from and how to manage impacts associated with the mining of those. It's important to note that when you're looking at the full life cycle assessment, the overall impact from wind and solar is generally lower than that of other energy developments, which include fossil fuels, but also renewable energy types such as biofuels and hydropower. Next slide, please. The good news is that a lot of these kind of risks and impacts can be avoided through appropriate early planning, and there's an important role to play not only for developers, but also at the government level and by conservation NGOs to help identify areas that are particularly sensitive, but equally areas that are more suitable for renewable energy expansion. And sensitivity mapping and strategic environmental assessment are important processes that can help inform appropriate siting. At the project scale, risk screening is an effective tool that can be used by developers to understand the biodiversity implications of a project, to identify mitigation, and importantly, in some cases, identify areas as unsuitable for renewable energy development due to the particular biodiversity risks. And it's worth noting as well that you need to account for the social impacts associated with biodiversity mitigation, particularly when you're undertaking things like biodiversity offsetting elsewhere, which can lead to displacement of people and have social impacts. Next slide, please. The report uses a number of diagrams to present a lot of this information. In this case, we have, you can imagine a project that has quite a significant potential impact, presented in orange. And in this case, there's been some success through citing the project in the area of lower biodiversity significance. But nonetheless, there are still a number of potential impacts that need to be addressed through further redesign of the project. You can imagine placing wind turbines in locations where they have a lower impact, but also looking at ways to undertake restoration of temporary facilities and around the turbines. And finally, looking at ways to address any residual impacts through the implementation of biodiversity offsets or measures that can be undertaken on site to enhance local habitats and bring back nature to that particular area. Next slide, please. The overall aim of many of these projects then, and increasingly, is to achieve a net positive outcome. So going beyond the kind of good practice on-site mitigation to actually deliver a project that, of course, harnesses energy from, the sun and wind, but also accounts for the impacts it's having to nature. And there are numerous additional conservation actions that can be undertaken proactively by developers to deliver such positive biodiversity outcomes. You can think of nature-based solutions such as undertaking rehabilitation to restore native flower beds and bring back important ecosystem services as well as natural values. And often there's opportunities during the repowering or decommissioning phase to address some issues that arose during the operations of a project. Of course, it's crucial to manage how the disposal and recycling and reuse of decommissioned projects, as this will help lower the impacts associated with mining by reducing the actual mining requirements. And in some cases, infrastructure components are better left as they are, and this is particularly the case for offshore wind farms, where in some cases the foundations have become important habitat to species and can provide enhancement benefits associated with that. So it's actually a good idea to leave those intact. This is just a brief snapshot of some of the findings, and of course a lot more can be found in the guidelines themselves, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan-Willem, for bringing us these insights. We're running a bit over time, but I think we will manage within time. A bit less time for questions, but let's move on. So now it's your time, Marte. Marte Rusten is a principal consultant with DNV, the in Norway and has been the lead author of this study. And she will give us a sneak peek of this study now. So the floor is yours, Marte.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Sven, for the introduction. Yeah. So I'm very happy to be here today to present a study that we have been performing for Nordic Energy Research the last few months on how to accommodate biodiversity and stakeholders when developing offshore wind in the Nordics. Wrong way.
The other way. There you go.
Yeah. Okay. So the aim of this study was to identify key elements and recommend actions to accommodate biodiversity and stakeholder engagements for further offshore wind developments in the Nordics, and also to illustrate these key elements with the case studies. So it's like a Nordic complement to the IUCN guidelines that we have heard about. And the process was to review authority literature and to discuss with stakeholders, manufacturers, regulators, scientific institutions, and NGOs. Okay, so the current situation of offshore wind in the Nordics for the bottom fixed and floating installations that are online or under construction are shown here. And as you can see, most of the activity is currently in Danish water. When it comes to bottom fixed installation, there's a little bit activity in Norway. When it comes to floating installation, we have the Hywind Tampen that is under construction in red there, and it's the test sites outside Karmøy that is online. But we will see a large increase in the connected capacity towards 2050. So this slide shows then the connected capacity in gigawatts in 2050 for the different Nordic countries, and with UK as comparison. And a fold increase compared to the current capacity is shown in red. So in Denmark there will be a 20-fold increase. Norway, 5,000 times increase, really just illustrates that there's not much activity in Norway on that now. And Sweden, 100 times. Finland, I think 20 times. Some numbers have fallen out, I see. And not much is known on the Iceland and the Faroes. And the UK, there will be a 5 times increase compared to current capacity. Yeah, and of course this large expansion entails both challenges and opportunities. So the challenges, of course, is that it will represent an additional pressures on ecosystems that are already under a lot of pressure. In the North Sea there is a decline in seabird populations, and most commercial fish stocks are also in endangered conditions. And the Baltic Sea, even worse, where many species and habitats are in particularly poor conditions. And and of course this then decrease the ecosystem's ability or their resilience towards additional pressures. And there's also a lack of baseline data on ecosystem, especially now with global warming. Things are happening fast, and it's really important to perform thorough baseline studies. And also there's a lack of knowledge on the impacts and the benefits and how to measure these from offshore wind developments. This is important because several operators are now claiming to be biodiversity net positive by 2030, for instance, but it's not sure really how to assess that. And there will be a conflict for space, especially with fisheries. And there are also quite complex stakeholder engagement processes in these projects, because offshore wind consortia are complex consortia. There are different partners in different parts of the projects. But for the opportunities, of course, the knowledge base is increasing. Lots of studies are going on. And because of the availability of wind resources, there is a flexibility for siting of projects. So it's especially for offloading wind, you can plan a way for some conflicts, which is a very interesting. And there is opportunities for coexistence with other industries. And there is also opportunities for ecosystem restoration. Just the fact that an offshore wind installation excludes fisheries and bottom trawling, it acts like a marine protected area for fish and benthic species. And of course, in the Nordic, there is a significant offshore experience to build on. In Denmark, offshore wind, and in Norway from the petroleum industry. And there will be it's important to leverage the existing collaboration frameworks in the Nordics to solve this and to leverage these opportunities and solve the challenges. Okay, so we have already heard a bit about biodiversity impacts. A positive indirect effect is, of course, that you conserve biodiversity by reducing GHG emissions. Direct impacts can be physical changes. You can have creation or loss of habitats. You have barrier effects that are hindering species in their regular movements. And you can have impacts on hydrodynamics resulting from changes in wind patterns in the wake of installations. There's underwater noise, which is maybe the most important acute impact from the construction phase of offshore wind. And there are impacts caused by electromagnetic fields, but more knowledge are needed to understand that better. And cumulative effects, that is the total impact arising from all activities in an area over time, is also very important to follow up on. And our study, we have then been looking into how the impacts can be mitigated in a Nordic context. And we have been studying the guidance documents in detail and really try to look into how can conflicts or impacts be avoided, and really strategic planning is key. That is the most important mitigation measure that you can do. And when it comes to minimization of the impacts that you cannot avoid, especially then you have to put in some efforts in the operation phase, for instance. We have identified that sound mitigation is very important. And then you must offset the impacts that you are not able to avoid or minimize. In the Nordics, there's not so much discussion about that, but in the UK, for instance, it's applied to compensate for impacts on birds, for instance, that you cannot minimize on site, and the operators are then asked to strengthen breeding colonies. And restoration, of course, relates to the restoring the damage that has been caused by previous impacts. Yeah. So the key elements that we have identified in our study is really the most important are strategic planning. It's about collecting and sharing environmental data. It's about assessing and understanding cumulative impacts. And it's to mitigate underwater noise. And it's to undertake and continue stakeholder engagement throughout the whole process. And then we have tried to illustrate those key impacts in 5 case studies. And the first one describes the Danish process of opening areas where they're really applying the avoidance as the main mitigation action, where they are looking first into a high-level screening process, identifying no-go areas, and then proceeds with more detailed screening to identify the areas that really has the best potential for energy production with the least impact on, or least conflict with other sea user interests. And the Danish governments are really working towards, they aim to have a very transparent and efficient approach to develop a one-stop shop for offshore wind so making the predictable framework for all stakeholders. And the second one is the High Wind Scotland Pilot Park case, which is describes how Equinor, which is the operator in this case, undertook a detailed project-specific microsite mapping of an area to identify the best location that had least impact on the environment and the best technical aspects to it. And of course, to understand the impact and to be able to mitigate them, it's important to perform environmental monitoring. And this case 3 describes then a governmental-led, operator-paid coordinating environmental monitoring process, similar for the offshore wind in Belgium and for the oil and gas industry in Norway, which is really has proven to be a very cost-efficient and a good way of collecting data that is also being publicly available to all interested parties, and with a thorough stakeholder involvement throughout the whole project. And then for the cumulative effects, it's really important to learn more about how effects accumulate, what are the ecological thresholds for that, and when are they exceeded. So we have highlighted 2 research projects, one called CEF in Scotland, Key Ecological Framework for Cumulative Framework for Key Ecological Receptors, and the MARSIS program in Norway. The CEF are looking at seabirds and marine mammals, and the MARSIS are looking at seabirds in particular. And the third one is the more operational one. It's about sound mitigation by using bubble currents. Okay, I will speed on. Okay, concluding remarks. Yeah. There are large planned expansion in the Nordics that entails both challenges and opportunities. There is a significant offshore experience in the area to build upon. And it's important to leverage existing Nordic frameworks for data collection and cumulative impact assessments. And it's important to establish dialogue and multinational processes for marine spatial planning at sea basin-wide scales, really, to understand and accommodate biodiversity and stakeholders. Yeah. And this study will be published at norden.org in January 2022. By Nordic Energy Research. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marte. Excellent presentation, and that was more than a sneak peek. I think we lost most of the report there, but anyway, it will be published and it will be available and downloadable. And all the presentations we're given today, these 3 rows of side events from Nordic Energy Research, will be available online, so you can review and revisit the slides. Last speaker, Marvin Smith.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much, Sven, and thank you to Nordic Energy Research for inviting me here today. Oh, I've gone the wrong way.
The other way around. Next. There you go.
Perfect. So I'm Marvin Smith, and I'm Head of Community Investment at the energy company SSE. And my job here today is to provide a practical case study of how an energy company can make the transition from high to low carbon, and to show how communities can be supported to play their part in the context of delivering offshore wind developments. And while I am talking very much from a UK and Irish perspective, I think there are principles that can be applied across the board. SSE is the largest generator of renewable energy in the UK and Ireland. We're investing £7.5 billion in 5 years into low-carbon energy infrastructure in Scotland, England and Ireland. We're involved in almost all aspects of the electricity supply chain. We generate it from wind, water and biomass. We transmit and distribute electricity in the north of Scotland and in central southern England. But right now, SSE is constructing more offshore wind capacity than any other developer in the world. And we are a perfect example of a company that needed to undertake a complete transition from high carbon electricity generation to low carbon. Our entire business strategy is defined by the response to climate change, and I would describe SSE as being 2/3 of our way to net zero. Not necessarily in terms of time taken, but certainly in terms of the reduction in our carbon emissions. 10 years ago, we were emitting 25 million tonnes of carbon. Now it's 7 million tonnes. And that's because we were an electricity generator split three ways between coal, gas and renewables. Now we have no coal and we are reaching 50-50 gas and renewables en route to net zero. We also have Paris-aligned science-based interim targets. The Paris Agreement has written into it the importance of a just transition if we are to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. In its simplest terms, a just transition is usually thought of as being, for example, workers in a high carbon role, such as coal miners, moving into jobs in green industries. But a broader definition of a just transition is about the fair distribution of climate goods and climate bads. Climate goods are all the wonderful things associated with climate action. Smart kit in our homes, clean air in our neighbourhoods, and opportunities for new jobs and skills. At SSE, we seek to share the value of what we do with the communities which host or are most impacted by our renewable assets. But there are bad things associated with climate action, prices on products and bills, or lost livelihoods. Last November, we published our own Just Transition strategy. We understand we were the first company in the world to do so. Our strategy has framed our thinking into two themes: the notion that we are transitioning into something new and green at the same time as exiting out of a high carbon activity. So we set out 20 principles that would guide us. We make commitments to workers, communities and consumers about the nature of the new green activity, things that you would expect like employment standards and standards in our supply chain. And in the process of transitioning out of high carbon activity, our first objective is to repurpose existing high carbon assets for a net zero world. But there have to be standards, safeguards and principles that govern the nature of the new that's being created. All too often, climate change and net zero are thought of as being a problem for technology to solve, that it's a technocratic problem and with technocratic answers. But the truth is, climate change is all about people. It's people who are creating it, it's people who will solve it, and it's people who will suffer because of its impact on the natural world. That's why it's important that the implications of both climate change and the transition to net zero on people are widely understood. It's crucial that people understand why we are building renewable assets in the first place. So when we build new assets, it's hugely important to SSE that we engage with stakeholders and local people in a responsible and sensitive way. It is true that not everyone will be in favour of new developments, but being transparent and sympathetic to different views helps us to build robust stakeholder relationships. And this is key to securing the public legitimacy needed to build these assets. At SSE, we have a long history of seeking to share the economic value from our renewable sites. We do this in a number of ways. The first is directly through the provision of community benefit funds. SSE's community funds in the UK and Ireland have a current lifetime value of over £300 million, and that's my day job. My team works with communities that host or are closest to our assets and supports them to invest our community funding in projects that help to build more resilient and sustainable communities. Funds from both our onshore and offshore wind farms are helping to transform what are often fragile rural communities, and there are very few strings attached to this funding. We believe in empowering communities to decide where the funding is utilised. Who better to know what is needed than the people who live in the local area? And the best thing is that communities are using this funding to address the issue of climate change at a grassroots level. We have many examples of where our funding is enabling communities to deliver innovative and exciting projects, such as electric vehicle rural transport projects, or the provision of new affordable housing which uses green technologies. But the most...
Marvin, we're running out of time.
Okay, I'll jump to this. So, just to go through... Oh, gone too far. Oops. So to conclude, the industrial transformations of the past are not covered in glory in terms of the impact on people and their communities. To prevent a repetition of history, we must recognise the scale of economic transformation net zero brings about, and there is a consensus across the industry and government to prevent the scale of human suffering that occurred in the past. I believe there is a real sense of momentum developing for a just transition to net zero, none more so than here at COP. But we must make sure that in making the transition to low carbon, we do so whilst maintaining the highest standards and respecting the communities in which we operate.
Thank you very much, Marvin. You sound like a very responsible energy utility. So it was interesting. Thank you. I would like to give you a chance from WWF to respond and comment on these various approaches. And I think you have something exciting to announce as well.
That's true, that's very true. Can you hear me okay? Yep. No, I just want to say thanks to everybody here for these different perspectives on this issue, which I think has not come to light very easily for a lot of different organisations. And I'd be interested to hear from you if there's anything on here which links to what you're involved with. But a couple of points coming up from the speakers. I mean, this is not just a public sector research initiative, it's a private sector aspect which needs to be taken into account to get real results for real stakeholders. So this is not just something we do on the side anymore, this is now mainline activity. And I think it's come out from all of the speakers, there's a triangle of links. It's between climate and energy and nature. And we have to start thinking about all of these three things together. And of course, energy, I've been involved with renewable energy for 30 plus years. And it's always been renewable energy, that's the way to go. That's always the solution. But in fact, there are downsides, and we have to understand what are the negative impacts of wind or solar or hydro or bioenergy. So we have to take that into account. So for me, the main message coming out from everybody here has been, we look at the right renewables in the right places. There's a big potential for wind power, offshore wind, we know that. But we have to be careful about the coral, about the deep sea mining. We have to understand what the issues are. But I know we're out of time very much, so I'm not going to say...
No, you have 2 more minutes. You can conclude, actually.
Okay, I can conclude. That's very good. So I do then just want to highlight a little bit about what was said from the SSSE side, is this just transition is a critical issue. Everybody talks about just transitions, and it's this sort of theoretical concept. But the fact is, it's at a local level, we have to understand what is the move from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. What is the impact of that? How does it affect the people? Where's the income generation? So that's something that we're also looking at, is almost a transformation in a global sense. So all of the different just transitions at a local sense need to be taken into account. What are the principles for energy to make that for fulfillment and make it sustainable? So I suppose that just brings me on to what you said, a specific thing. We've also recognized this energy and nature issue. We need to be getting more and more focused. We've spoken to lots of organizations about this. So I'm very pleased to say that on Friday, we will in fact launch a new venture with a number of nature organizations and energy sector organizations, which we're calling the Coalition Linking Energy and Nature for Action. So this is not just a concept that we'll talk about anymore, it's about what can we do to make these links, to make it effective, and to have some real impact in the longer term. So if you're interested, 12 o'clock on Friday at the WWF Pavilion, we're launching this new initiative with these different organizations involved to build upon all of the messages and the experience that you've heard about today. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you, Dean. And thank you, panelists, for sharing a lot of knowledge and information. And I think we have the audience online and here and in Helsinki and elsewhere have learned a lot by you. So with these words, I'll say have a nice evening and thank you very much for coming. And thank you very much, audience, for taking part.